It's great to welcome Professor Catherine Pakaluk on this program once again. She teaches at the Catholic University of America. And today we're discussing her book, which she co-authored with Trent Horn, the famed Catholic speaker and apologist, titled Can a Catholic Be a Socialist? Parentheses, the answer is no. Here's why. Catherine, welcome to the show once again. How are you?
Thank you. Great to see you.
Yeah, we had the fortune of seeing each other in Budapest when you
Yes,
visited here a few months ago. I hope you enjoyed the trip.
I loved my trip. It was wonderful. Only too short a little bit.
Yeah, certainly.
Mhm.
Yeah, hope to see you here again sometime.
Yes.
Okay. So first, I'd like to ask, how did the book come about? How did you and Trent work together on this text?
Yeah. So the story goes back a number of years now, and really a mutual friend of ours posed me the question. He said, I have a friend who is an apologist and more of a theologian, and he wants to collaborate with an economist on a book related to socialism and property, and 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 he said something like, well, would you be interested in doing something like that and writing about socialism? And I will tell you that in the back of my mind, I thought, no, there's nobody that I would want to collaborate with on this topic. It's a difficult topic, and typically there's a lot of background that needs to be covered. And I thought, I don't see this as an attractive idea. And he said, no, 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 listen, you don't understand this guy, Trent. He's a friend of mine, and I think you'll really enjoy working with him. And I said, all right, well, I'll have a phone call with him. And so we had a chat on the phone, and we started to speak about some of the topics. And I thought, wow, I mean, I don't know this guy's background, but he really is well versed in some of this material. So then I was very impressed, and I thought, okay, this would be a good book to work on with Mr. Horn. And so I tell that story in part because it's one of the reasons why the book needed to be written, is that typically speaking, people who are very well educated in other aspects of the Catholic faith are often not well studied in very simple things related to political economy.
Certainly. Yeah. Yeah, Trent's a great speaker. I've read
Yeah.
numerous books from him, and my
Yeah.
faith in the Catholic Church has been like greatly bolstered by his
Yeah.
writings.
Yes, 100%.
So, what do you hope that Catholic readers, or even non-Catholic readers, Christian, non-Christian, would take away from reading this book?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. I mean, I only told you part of the background, but maybe the second part of the background is worth telling as an answer to this question. The reason for the book in the year that it was written, it was published in early in 2020, which was a presidential campaign season, and uh, Trent and I both thought that perhaps Bernie Sanders would be a major contender for the nomination. And of course, Bernie ran on a democratic socialism platform. So we hoped that the text would help educate Catholic readers around the country, and perhaps non-Catholic readers who are just interested and curious. Um, as you know, the United States has a growing and large Hispanic population as well. They're mostly Catholics and voters, and so we thought that perhaps this would seek, would have a lot of reach. Now, as it turns out, early in 2020, the book came out, and then sort of within a few weeks, COVID occurred. And so actually the book didn't reach a large audience at that time. And then of course Bernie Sanders was not a nominee. And so for a couple of reasons, the book probably in that year didn't have the reach that we intended it to have. But now just completely answering your question, we believed at the time and still believe that there are very simple kind of fallacies or mistakes that people make about, we can say, property as sort of the basis of the church's theology against the claims of the socialists. So fallacies about that, but also fallacies about the history of Christian thought. So you hear these casual claims all the time, like Jesus and his apostles had everything in common, or the early Christians were definitely communist or socialist. You hear this all the time, and I don't think people have a good sense of what that means. So we really hope the book would dispel certain myths, but also help to lay out the elements of the church's teaching and what it where it comes from.
Certainly. Yes.
Yeah,
And I certainly hope that this conversation may help spark a renewed
yeah,
interest in the book.
yeah. Well, we have, of course, new discussions of. I mean, socialism constantly comes back; it's never gone, and this is, of course, an interesting feature of this back and forth about socialism. And so we have this candidate for mayor of New York City who is a very blatant socialist, and so I mean, the topic is, obviously evergreen. I wish it were not, but it is.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mr. Mamdani.
Mamdani, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
So a quotation from the book says, not only are Catholics not obligated to be socialists, we cannot be socialists. So first, I'd like to give us a
Hmm.
working definition of socialism. What is it?
Yeah. So we work primarily in the book with the definition that the papal writings work with. And of course, we explore the ways in which socialism has evolved in its usage politically. Um, but the main definition that the popes use, especially in the late 1800s, is the confiscation or the appropriation of property to be held in common. And typically, what this means is not is some kind of policy against private property and a transferal of the right and the usage of property and perhaps the means of production. We can kind of explore what that means to the state, we say. But of course, the state just means like those human beings who happen to be exercising political control for the sake of the commonwealth, we could say. So really simply the abolition of private property. That's the language that the Pope uses, the abolition of private property and, various ways of schemes of transferring the ownership of private property, but perhaps even more importantly, the direction of corporate production, the transfer of authority for corporate production companies and firms under the direction of some kind of state body. It's usually, commissions and right, because we always forget like who's the state. The state isn't a fictional entity. The state is other persons that have been elected or perhaps have seized power in some way or another. Yeah, so fundamentally, the abolition of private property or taking the view, as some people do, and this becomes more sort of the view of the democratic socialists, taking the view that if that sort of private property is property that doesn't serve the common good, and so as much as possible, the job of the Commonwealth is to direct or to redirect property that may be in the hands of individuals like you and me, our wages or our savings accounts, to actually serve the common good, and that the way private property serves the common good is by being redistributed by the state. So you could have a kind of democratic socialist situation where you don't abolish private property, but you merely let the state or let the government officials redirect a tremendous portion of the private property of individuals for various, allegedly good goals. So, we can think there of like a very generous democratic sort of, or we'll say social welfare state that doesn't like officially abolish private property, but redistributes, I don't know, 40, 50, 60, 70% of the incomes of people for public use.
Is it? Yeah. For the most part, at least in the United States, those who are avowedly democratic socialists, say
Yeah.
members of the DSA, Mr. Mamdani, for
Yeah.
example, as well as other prominent New York political figures, like say Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez,
Yes.
they would steer away from the rhetoric of state control as well as the abolition of
Yeah.
private property, but they would
Yes.
really emphasize the language of rights. So
Hmm.
if they are elected or if they maintain their power, then people will have these rights, the right to, say, go to the
Yeah.
hospital free of charge, or the right to go to the supermarket and not having to pay for the food, and also right to
Right.
free public transit.
Right.
Um, to what extent are these rights legitimate under, say, Catholic social teaching or
Hmm.
in a constitutional democracy
Yeah.
like America?
Yeah. Well, you're a philosopher. So, what I want to try
Unlicensed.
to do, well, you are a philosopher, and I'm not a philosopher, but I'm familiar at least with the history of the language around rights. I mean, my point is, the language around rights is pretty complicated, and so, all right. So, what you find in the language of the popes in the 19th century, when they begin to talk about these things, and when they talk about them as sort of pressing social concerns. I mean, the history of like, let's say, the teachings of the scholastic theologians and the fathers of the church, going all the way back to the beginning, is that private property is not to be held with contempt, and is something that's important. And but what happens is, it's there's not really like an agitated social movement to take away property until fairly until basically the 19th century. You have like these earlier, the Saint-Simonians in France, and you've got, certainly to some extent, the French Revolution embodies some of these ideals. And then, of course, you have Marx and later Frederick Engels, and then the agitation of the workers' movements. And so then the popes start talking about this. You alluded to sort of what is the position of the church on these rights to free things, you said. And I think you're exactly right to say that where this debate has gone in our contemporary political discourse, and I think it's much harder to argue with it. It's harder to debate it because no one's few people are arguing for something that sounds like the abolition of property, right? They say, no, no, you can have your property, but you have to send me a big portion of it, and so how much is too much? With the language of the popes, so first of all, on this point about rights, the church has always been hesitant to adopt the I guess I would say like the hardcore language of the natural rights, because of some of the philosophical baggage attached to the sort of the philosophical and political natural rights language. However, what you do find is that the popes in the late 1800s say, well, look, for all intents and purposes, we can use this language as long as you understand we are grounding them properly, right? These are things that are grounded in nature, and God is the author of nature. And so if individuals have some kind of, we'll say, right, that is something that comes out of a duty. So this is like this old classical language, the Ciceronian, and certainly deeper than that. I mean that rights in us. So let's just take something that's a very classic and easy, uncontested right in the history of Catholic thought, is that let's say I as a woman, I have a right to worship God. Now that right to worship God is a claim placed on other people. So let's say you must not prevent me from worshiping God. So my right comes from where? It comes from, well, God says I must worship God on Sunday in particular, and then in other ways. So God has placed a duty on me because God is the creator. And that duty that God places on me as a creature exists in me prior to coming into a state or a community, like a political community. It existed when I was in let's say, a so-called state of nature, although the church doesn't like the language of state of nature. It existed before the political entity of the state. So because God put duties in, they're built into the structure of reality. I owe God something. So like when we say we owe God, that's something that's a jus, like it's a right. It's something that he has a claim on my worship. But that claim that God has on my worship creates a secondary claim on you, or that I have a right for you not to interfere with my worship of God. Okay. So the church is happy to use right in that sense, as long as we understand that that a true right, a right that's grounded in nature, is comes out of some corresponding duty. All right. So what about rights to free stuff? What about rights to education or rights to housing or some of the other things that you hear from AOC or Mamdani or any of these like contemporary democratic socialists? Well, what you sort of see immediately is that each right has to be taken in relation to the duties of normal life. So let's take education for a minute. So education is a common one in the United States. In every municipality, students have a political right to attend a public school, which has been paid for by the tax dollars of everyone. So we understand it as like this is something that we do, and it's something. Okay, but in Catholic thought, do children have a right to an education? What does that mean? Well, they do, but the children have a right to an education because the parents have a duty to educate them. So the church has spent a lot of time on this. Well, who has the responsibility to educate children? Is it the state or the Commonwealth, or is it the parents? Is it the church? Well, in the case of children and education, the church spent a lot of time on this. Well, the parents and the church essentially share that responsibility. The popes say, well, the state has some claim. For instance, the state can say, well, it's important for students to learn what it's required to be a good citizen, but that the state cannot ever have full authority because the child has a supernatural end and the state is not competent to direct the child to that supernatural end. Only the church can do that. So you see where I'm saying that each of these rights to something free have to be grounded in a proper duty, not a made up duty. All right. So, as regards education, what we would say is, well, the church agrees that children have a right to be educated, but does not agree that the state has that responsibility. The parents and the church have that responsibility. And then, insofar as the church has commented about, say, the financing of education, the church more or less thinks, look, you should make sure that parents have the resources that they need. If the state is going to set up some kind of redistributive function to pay for education, if, right, doesn't say that it must, but if it does so, it should not certainly be evil to prevent religious entities and churches from accessing that same like pot of dollars. Okay, that's so I'll get finally around to the thing that you mentioned, which is do, say, poor people or people who are suffering from not, just not accessing some of the goods of human life that seems to motivate a lot of the democratic socialists. We'll say, like in the most charitable interpretation, do they have a right to be handed stuff from the public purse, so to speak? And this is really interesting. So what the church has said is that, well, yes, in a sense, the poor and the indigent have a right to appreciate and enjoy the good things of the earth. But that right arises from the duty of people with money or people with resources and wealth to share what they have with others. So, in other words, there's a very strong claim that the church places on wealthy people or people, really anybody with excess above what they need to support themselves, to share with others. It's a call to charity. It's a call to give. So, in the history of the church, the understanding is that's almsgiving, and that's a very strict obligation for wealthy people. Now, so that sounds like a right, but it's not a political right to have the apparatus of the state move in to kind of extract a certain amount of income and then have it get re-handed out. And I think there are good reasons to suggest that if that's the means we use, right, the end is clear, is that the poor do have a right to our goods, at least in the history of the church. But the means we use are not necessarily neutral. And so if we use the state apparatus of taxing and redistributing, there may be very good reasons to question whether or not we've accomplished let's say, the spiritual virtues that the church wants to protect in, we'll say, like a kind of divine economy. So it's a little bit complicated to answer your question, but I think it's in no way like a simple conclusion that because the poor do have a right to our goods, that the way it should occur is in this highly redistributive way. So when it comes to evaluating the means to which the poor have a right to certain things, then we have to bring in not only the things that the church has already mentioned, look, like how are the wealthy supposed to grow in holiness, which is something the church cares a lot about. Well, one of the ways the wealthy are supposed to grow in holiness is to let go of some of their stuff. They're not supposed to hoard their stuff. That's one thing that the church has commented on. But the other thing that can certainly enter the conversation about the means that the poor have to access that right is kind of like the ordinary study of economic science. So, are there reasons, just drawing from the study of political economy, why you would not perhaps favor a very large welfare state as the way to get those things to the poor who deserve them? And of course, I think there might be some strong reasons there. And that would not be the ordinary expertise of the church. That would be something you would expect some collaboration with the theologians and the economists on that point.
Mhm. Certainly. Yeah, I believe you've alluded to this, but another dimension of the American socialist rhetoric is this idea of redistribution of wealth and income.
Hmm.
This idea that
Yeah,
the wealthy should pay their fair share of taxes, or basically not be as wealthy as they are. Um,
yeah.
Now, a surface reading of, say, the Gospels would find certain
Hmm.
passages like it's more difficult for a camel to travel through the eye of the
Hmm.
needle. You fill in the rest, and
Yeah,
um, also how when Zacchaeus, the tax collector, was
yeah.
redeemed by Jesus, he vowed to give half of his income to the poor and repay fourfold the wealth that he's taken away from those he collected
Right.
taxes
Extorted.
for.
Yeah.
So why is this vision of redistribution of wealth and income proposed by the socialists
Mhm.
incompatible with what Jesus teaches?
Yeah. Well, I think it comes down to the question of virtue. Um, I think with most things, you have sort of maybe two sides, and I kind of alluded to it last time, but I'll just spell it out more specifically. There's kind of will it work? Like, does it accomplish the thing that you want it to accomplish? You could think about this with all kinds of social goals that you have in mind. And the second question is it just or is it right? Or is it something we should be aiming at? And so the problem with redistribution is that, it largely tends not to work. And an interesting question is like typically the socialists mostly trade on the question of justice. And they make their claim and they appeal to, I think, a natural instinct in us that on the one hand, empathizes with the poor, empathizes with those who have less. We see in the other suffering individual like all kinds of dimensions. It could be me, and I have an obligation to treat this person like my brother. And so, it's the socialists too often skip over, from like they appeal to justice, but in fact, what we see in practice is that oftentimes these schemes don't really work very well, or they work to accomplish something, but not everything. So, just as a for instance, an interesting point is that in the United States, we've actually made tremendous strides in eliminating food insecurity or food poverty. You can just look at the anti-poverty programs of the 1960s and 1970s, which are still in place in the welfare system. In fact, food poverty. I'm not here to say that there is no insecurity of food left in the United States, but we've made tremendous strides. There's a very small number of people who are and why? Because we have tremendous redistribution of access to food stamps, and other forms of assistance. Um, but like the question is like, what was the goal of the program? Was the goal of the program to eliminate poverty, or is the goal of the program to sort of raise people up in certain ways? So we've got two problems. One is that the poor in general are poorly nourished. So they are oftentimes overweight and have very poor health outcomes, maybe subject to diabetes or other sort of heart diseases because their diets are very, very poor. So we've sort of like accomplished one thing, which is that people aren't starving to death. We've done that with the redistribution, but actually we haven't managed to make it the case that the poor eat and flourish physically the way that the wealthy do. So what that requires is all kinds of education and mentorship and a commitment to a certain kind of virtuous living, a certain active lifestyle, like all kinds of things. So it turns out it's really difficult to redistribute that stuff, the stuff that really is the substance of, kind of like not give a man a fish, but teach a man to fish, that kind of thing. But what we're dealing with today isn't like fish insecurity, right? That you can't get people fish. You can get them fish. The problem is that what we manage to do is make people kind of wards of the state who kind of get their fish delivered, and it's usually pretty, bad fish. We are not able, functionally, we have not figured out a way to pass out money or money in kind as food and other goods in such a way as to really enable the poor to live the blessings that the wealthy live. Okay, and I'm mentioning this in particular because there's just been a new round of research done on sort of cash transfer programs, universal basic incomes, which have the same idea at heart, right? So moving past like welfare redistribution for food, say, or housing. Same thing happens with housing, by the way. You can get people off the street into government provided housing or government subsidized housing, but it tends to be really like low quality and not excellent housing in a lot of ways. And so these new studies on universal basic income, what did they do? They basically got, extra cash to low income households. And then this was all done very well, like randomized controlled trials, and then check and see what you see at the end. And basically, people are throwing up their hands and saying, we had a lot of high hopes for these programs. We thought this money would give people the opportunity not just to alleviate some of the hardships of being poor, but to start to plan ahead, to open a business, to like get an education, like maybe purchase a degree program that would allow them to have a better job. And they basically found like almost no impact. And this was interesting in the United States discourse. It's really ongoing right now. There's a couple of big op-eds in the last week. I think one in the Boston Globe, which I would direct you to, and can send you a link to that, maybe for your notes. Uh, it, a lot, a lot of high-profile supporters of the universal basic income kind of came out and said this was very disappointing. We really believe that if you could just get people enough money to get over the threshold of living at the edge, that you would see really big changes. And really, we didn't see big changes. Okay, so this comes back to this question you asked, like, how come these redistributive programs don't accomplish this thing that Jesus is talking about, like the wealthy just give away their stuff? And I think the reason comes back to somehow the two, I would say the two human beings on the sides of the exchange. So on the wealthy side, Zacchaeus, his wealth, we want to see what Jesus wants us to copy is like this act of virtue that we come to see that we've received something that we, in a sense, don't have a right to, not in a like a philosophical sense, like that kind of the structure of reality is I'm recipient of something that I could hardly pay back. I mean, just living is a gift, and then you keep going. And so there's the conversion of heart that takes place. Jesus wants that to occur as a precondition. Right? And so the tax system, tax and transfer, we would say, operates regardless of whether there's a conversion of heart. So there's not an opportunity for virtue. We certainly know that if you take 25, 35, 45, 50, 60, 70% of someone's income, there is definitely a strong crowding out effect which is, I think I've already given my money away, or I don't, you've already taken from me a big percentage. So even if I have my conversion of heart, how much left do I have to give? The tax system has already taken it. So, number one, on the one side of the wealthy, the redistribution eliminates or makes pale or like reduces the opportunity for the virtuous act in the wealthy person. And in the second place, it seems to lack the it lacks the it lacks the formative and transformative effect of receiving charity in a way that allows people to truly change their lives. On that point, all we can do really is point to, a history of charitable activity that the church has been involved with. That we don't have great studies. I'm just here to tell you that the economists are not doing randomized controlled trials with church charitable activities because that's what we would want to compare. We want to compare a UBI situation with what happens when people receive charity in that personal context, right? We have perhaps some suggestive evidence. We know that, for instance, working with prisoners, faith-based programs work better with prisoners than non-faith-based programs. When we think about people changing their lives, we certainly can tap into some suggestive evidence, but that's the other side is how do you really accomplish what you want to accomplish, which is to invite through fellowship, solidarity, participation, like a full, essentially change of heart in somebody who's less well off and who needs not just material resources, but they need emotional support. They need mentorship. They need to be sort of taught how to live. Historically, of course, the religious orders did a tremendous amount of this. And so, of course, I'm optimistic that like a flourishing of new religious orders could lead us back to a revival of, we would say, this kind of ancient type of Christian charity. But of course, I'm just, I'm just describing what I think could happen and not what's really happening in lots of places yet.
Certainly. Yeah. Yeah, we can all hope. Okay.
Yeah.
So what is the appeal of socialism that you find to be the most enduring?
Yeah. I think the appeal is a half truth, which is the one we mentioned, which is that there's a kind of an inner sense that people who are well off have. We sometimes lately we've relabeled this guilt, like we call it guilt, but I actually don't think it's guilt. I think it's a sense internal, an evaluation that although I may have worked hard and I may have certain gifts, that the good things that I enjoy are not are in some way still a mystery to me. They're a gift to me, or we recognize like, you know, but for some accidents of time and place, I could be in anyone else's shoes, and that truth that somehow like the things that I have, I don't really deserve them in some metaphysical sense. I think that that truth is very appealing for the wealthy. They don't know how to thank God properly. Maybe they haven't been well catechized, and then they don't really know what to do with their wealth. They actually haven't been taught how to. So it appeals to wealthy. I mean, let's be clear. Like, AOC or Mamdani, like they're actually they have a tremendous popularity among very wealthy voters. So that's the appeal there. And then, of course, I think on the side of the less well off, the appeal is again that same idea. It's like, well, I recognize that there is some act of there may be some aspect to the outcomes in economic life that is based on effort and hard work. But you see, if you're the poor, the working poor, and you see, well, clearly, like what makes me different from that guy, some of it's luck. And when it seems like it's luck, then it really looks like it's not really fair, is it? It's not really fair that some people, through what seems like luck, which has no, it has, I mean, luck has no personality. Luck is a toss of the dice. just hard to know what to do with that. And ultimately, of course, this is another way to rename the problem of evil. Normally we think about the problem of evil in terms of like, well, why does this person have cancer and I'm fine? Or we could just let's rephrase it more carefully, like, why am I sick? Why do I have to die? So we actually start to think about the problem of evil, typically not in a relative way. But if we begin to think about it in a relative way, why me and not her, or vice versa, immediately that we have this question of fairness. Like we both seem pretty equal in dignity and worth. And so why would I suffer and this other person not suffer? So of course, with disease and death, accidents that happen, we can apply that question of the problem of evil. With economics or economic outcomes, it's essentially the same question. It seems like, well, there's no real explanation for why some people have more and some people have less. And then imagine if you could do this for illness. But for economics, it looks like there's a quick, obvious fix. Just take some from you and give it to somebody else and even it out, right? Could you do this with health outcomes or with cancer? Well, you've got a deadly cancer and I have nothing. I'm perfectly healthy. If we had some mechanism by which we could make your cancer less deadly and give me a share in your suffering, I think a lot of people would sign up for that. I actually think we would like to redistribute all kinds of burdens to overcome this basic question of fairness. So I think that appeal comes both for the wealthy and for the less wealthy from a fundamental frustration with the way the world is, the way the world is.
Yes. Um, I believe the pioneering document in Catholic social teaching is Rerum Novarum,
Mm,
right? Pope Leo the
yes,
13th. And we have a long line
yes,
of popes that take inspiration from this document, as well as many lay and clergymen, members of the church.
right.
Uh, what is
Hmm.
remarkable about Rerum Novarum is that while socialism is condemned, so is a laissez-faire, hands-off kind of capitalism.
Hmm.
And I'm sure the popes after Leo the 13th and even the current one, Leo the 14th, subscribe to
Yeah.
this line of thinking too. So,
Hmm.
what type of economic system should a Catholic support?
Hmm. That's a great question. And I think I would go ahead and quote John Paul II, who says something like, the church doesn't have a system. The church is not in favor of a system. We have no system to present. And in fact, that's true. The church doesn't have a system. I mean, for instance, like taking the political side, forget about economics for a minute. The church would certainly be in support of a Catholic monarchy, right? But the church has also said clearly, maybe with less enthusiasm, that it's fine to have a representative democracy as well. So the church isn't going to say, you have to support one type of political order or another. But the church is going to say, although we don't have a system that you have to choose a political order, you certainly can. Here are the things you cannot have. So basically, the church places some systems or some particular, we'll say, order, some particular types of economic orders as off limits. By and large, by the way, these are usually cashed out in terms of commandments not to do things. So, so you could have a monarchy or a constitutional republic, but you cannot have any right political order in which it's authorized for private persons to take the lives of other citizens, right? And so we could debate whether the church thinks the death penalty is permissible or even like a good idea today. People are debating that. They do debate that, but certainly no correct order can sanction the taking of innocent human life, right? So, as a for instance, the church will say, look, you know, you can't have a just political order if you allow abortion. Okay. So something similar happens with economics. The church has no system to support. meaning I would say varieties of economic systems are acceptable to the church. She doesn't really have any expertise to weigh in on that. So long as what has to occur, and I would say kind of two things, like two things very generally speaking. One is that your economic system or order must must protect private property, must support private property, must understand it to be good, not like a I mean, the church says this about politics as well. Like, you can't see government as an evil thing, like the way maybe some libertarians would say, well, it's kind of like a necessary evil to have government. Church will say, no, no, look, government's not evil. It's not a necessary evil. Um, you have to have some government because we're fallen and there's all kinds of reasons. So similarly, a good political order, sorry, a good political economy cannot view property as like an evil to be sort of like minimized. You know, we can't take everyone's property away, but we'll redistribute it as much as possible because ultimately property is the source of social disorder. Well, that was Marx's view, right? That property and various versions of it, marriage, Marx said, was based on the property. The husband owns the wife, and the parents own the children, and so marriage and the family have to be destroyed. Private material property has to be destroyed. So basically, it has to be a system that is fundamentally based on property. Now that we don't have to call that capitalism, but we do have to sort of think about that as like a market economy or one in which sort of and this is again language that John Paul II used, like the business economy. But what's the other point? You said, well, the church or Leo the 13th rejects a kind of laissez-faire.
Yes.
Um, yes. And what was really meant by that at the time when he wrote that letter was uh, the failure or the unwillingness of either political officials or we'll say, you know, other political officials, ministers of the state, lawyers who worked in the contracts in labor contracts, the unwillingness to see that workers, by and large, workers as a class, but workers in different industries, had some kinds of rights again, ordered by God or that existed prior to the state, that the state, but more importantly, businesses and labor contracts had to respect. So when we say laissez-faire, we largely mean in the late 1800s to reject a laissez-faire attitude towards labor relations. And of course, sometimes the subheading of Rerum Novarum is on the condition of the working classes. And so what you see there is a dedication in the second half of or maybe the last two-thirds of it, to the different types of things that the Pope exhorts business owners and states as much as possible to respect. So, what are those things? Well, protecting the Sabbath, making sure that your workers have time to attend church. Like you can't expect them to work 7 days a week. That violates a kind of natural, right that they have. But again, that right is a claim on the workers created by this duty that God has placed in your workers. So respecting the Sabbath, making sure that promises to pay are fulfilled, right? You can't withhold wages from workers. Using all, we'll say, appropriate and workable means to make sure that that workers are have the opportunity to earn a kind of living wage. We could talk about that. Not overtaxing the strength of women and children. Trying to protect as much as possible the time of childhood for children to attend some school or that kind of thing. So you see a long list, and they're basically, we think of them as like the rights of the workers. But the popes, of course, insist like these things are not things that we're making up. They're things that are deep in nature. And then, of course, something that's very important to Pope Leo is also the rights of, we'll say, fathers as heads of household, but also he also puts it as like the family, the integrity of the family unit. And so the Pope, of course, also mentions that in order to help families, the church can, I'm sorry, the state can sometimes do too much and actually has to sort of make sure that there's a balance. And we see this with this discussion about redistribution. The children are supposed to depend on their father in nature. And so the Pope warns about doing too much or setting up permanent institutions that make the fathers less less important, and says if you have to help, that it should be temporary and with a view to restoring the headship of the father. So those are the kinds of things. But this idea that kind of like businesses and companies should have zero oversight when it comes to how they treat their workers, the Pope's rejected that.
Mhm. Now, in terms of just surface rhetoric, there are
Hmm.
many parts in which proponents of Catholic social teaching, like you and I, and
Hmm.
Pope Leo the 14th, as well as
Yeah,
those who are of the democratic socialist persuasion, would agree upon. We
yeah,
would agree that workers have rights and a minimum wage should be implemented,
yeah.
um, as well as the preferential uh, option for the poor.
Hmm.
So, to what extent can we, in some ways, convert a democratic socialist to someone who adheres to Catholic social
Hmm.
teaching?
Well, it's hard to say. Um, you asked about earlier what was the appeal of
Right.
socialism.
Yeah.
And another way to put the appeal is to, and maybe to answer the question you're asking now, is to think about how people orient themselves to God's providence. So, one answer to the problem of evil, right, is suffering and, of course, inequality. One answer is to recognize that God is a good father. And though it may look as if he's handed me something that's less good, no, in fact, like nobody cares more about my good than God does. And that God is always looking after me, right? We have these other passages from the gospel, right? That even the hairs in your head are counted, and that no, just as no sparrow falls to the ground, how much more does your father know what's happening to you, right? So don't worry so much about. So there's this, and I think this is a way to answer your question is kind of like, where is our faith, and how much faith is needed to trust the order, to trust the natural order of things. So one way to think about the spectrum of, we'll say, rhetoric and the spectrum of policies promoted by people, I think, is to think about how much trust people are willing to place in the goodness of other people, right? Because the answer that those who prefer a smaller redistributive state, as I do, the standard argument is, well, you don't care about the poor. Well, no, 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 I do. I would place a lot more, I would place a lot more like moral suasion on the wealthy to give. And so, how much faith do you? So, one way to think about like the goal of the democratic socialists or the more extreme proponents of redistribution would be say, well, I don't really trust at the end of the day that we're going to get the job done. Like, there's going to be all these people who fall through the cracks, right? The sort of the cracks in the social safety net. So we just have to keep growing this net. Um, so coming back to your question, my own conviction is that to persuade people who believe in a bigger redistributive state, what's required tends to be evangelization, which is to kind of work on this idea that God's providence is sufficient and that God does take care of needs. So now, but what I just said, of course, is difficult. That's not a policy program, like a policy of evangelization. But I'll just use an example from my current work, which maybe is useful here, which is this question of how many children families are choosing to have these days. And I've spent many hours interviewing very religious families about the size of their family. We know that greater religious participation and greater religious devotion tends to correlate with higher family size. And one of the things I'm trying to investigate is why is that? Why do these people with more faith? Because very few, I mean, there are not any specific religious traditions right now that sort of mandate a large family. So then why would it be the case? And what you hear over and over from really religious families is they say, well, God loves children and God wanted us to have children and God promised that he would provide. So they give you this story all the time about how, well, we understand that God in the scriptures says, be fruitful, multiply. And we also understand in all of these places in the history of God's relationship with human beings that he promises to provide for us. And then this is exactly how these interviews go. And then what people will say is this, and we've seen this is true in our own lives. When we had our first baby, we didn't know what to expect. We were young. We didn't have a lot of money. And then, things worked out. They'll say, I got a promotion. I got this other thing. And we've seen this happen 2 or 3 times. And now we just trust that whatever children we have, God will provide for them. And ultimately, like that's, I think, the kind of dividing line between people who want to eliminate the insecurity. They want to say, look, there's got to be like a guaranteed foolproof way to get money from some people into the hands of other people so that nobody falls through the cracks, so that provision always takes place. But of course, like my position will be like, no, that's not happened. It's not happened anywhere. There's still people falling through the cracks all over the place. Then there's the spiritual falling through the cracks, which we've talked about. That there's another way. Another way is to lean into like God created all this inequality, like it's in us, it's in reality, and that He means to address it through personal charity and mentorship and brotherhood. But that the only way we can get people to do that is to exercise moral suasion. And that's not really, none of us wants to live in that state, right? That if we relegate that kind of moral suasion, like the state is constantly telling you how much to give away or whether to go to church, maybe even taking attendance, right? That's a theocratic state that I think has not been supported by Christians or Jews. So the alternative is to say, well, actually, what you have to do is let these religious communities really flourish and take on that kind of charity at a very high level. But you can't outcompete them. You can't take all of their income so they've got nothing left to work with. Or you can't bar them from accessing money that has been set aside to pay for education. So I think coming back to your question, I think I tend to see it as maybe we can think of it on a spectrum. I don't mean to make it black and white, but that people do have a different tolerance level for the kind of messiness of the outcomes that occur in human life, and that those who for reasons of their religious convictions or lack thereof cannot tolerate the messiness, they tend to seek to create these structures to eliminate the insecurity of human existence. I just think that, in fact, they don't do it. And in fact, it has many other adverse consequences. And so maybe that's a way to think about this difference. So I think it tends to come down to a kind of faith experience, or I mean, I can think of somebody, a popular Twitter account in the United States. You find these characters a lot, but I can also think of like Michael Novak as somebody that we've both read and benefited very much from. Many people who come up as young, this Twitter account is Matt Swole, and he's somebody who even 5 years ago was very very left wing progressive, but was changed and through COVID and then more recently through watching the response of religious people to the severe needs of people in China who suffered from that terrible storm that created flooding and really tremendous suffering in Western North Carolina. I mean, this is just recently, a couple of years ago, Asheville area and those mountains. And he said, you know, I've never, he said, sure. I mean, there was a problem getting FEMA funding and there was a problem getting some of the fund. There's many public bodies that are set up to provide relief. He said, but you know what happened? Like the Amish people came out of their communities and started rebuilding bridges and homes. And Christian churches started setting up food, soup kitchens. And he said, I've never seen anything like it. He said, at the end of the day, at some point, you realize like there really isn't a way, no matter how much money you throw at it, you still have the fundamental problem of what kind of support people need. It's like, my point is, every few years, you see these characters who reflect on whether or not the goals, which are admirable, the goals of the democratic socialists, are achievable with the means that they have at their disposal. So at best, you could say, look, I mean, even if you want to have, you know, billions and billions of dollars devoted to these various efforts, trillions of dollars in some cases, at the end of the day, you still need the Amish to come around and rebuild your homes. And so if that's the case, like maybe we should rethink this. Maybe we should, rethink our orientation to what motivates people to give and to so I think like I'm not super optimistic that a kind of simple policy conversation about means can be highly persuasive because as many times as you persuade people that the systems, the political systems will fail, because they will fail, because they're still operated by human beings. They still often are committed to the justice of, at least in principle, somebody's dollars will flow into your bank account. So you kind of, it's sort of a funny spot. You want to keep saying, look, it doesn't work. Like what you want doesn't work. But there is a hesitation in wanting to throw ourselves into the insecurity of nature, which I understand. It's pretty scary.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you very
Yeah.
much, Catherine Pakaluk, for joining the show.
You're welcome.